battlefield was a graveyard of the fallen. A sea of corpses sank into the blood-drenched mud. Torn banners flapped in the howling wind, and the sky hung low and dark, as if the gods themselves bore witness to the carnage below. One was Horn the Red, his chest heaving. His beard was matted with blood, his own and that of countless enemies. His arms ached, but his grip on his twin axes was iron. Even wounded, even battered, he stood tall. His enemies had taken much, but not his strength, not his fire. Second was Civ Wolfborn, his wife, his war-bound love. She bled from a dozen wounds, her once bright war paint smeared with crimson. Her swords trembled in her hands, but only from exhaustion, not fear. Fear had no place here, only death. And death had come for them. The enemy swarmed, a never-ending tide of steel and flesh, armored boots crunching over the bones of the fallen. Their spears gleamed red. The swords glistened with fresh kill. Horn rolled his shoulders, ignoring the pain of torn flesh. "We should be dead by now," he said. Civ only gave a savage grin, dripping blood from her lips, responding, "Then we are already legends." The enemy came, roaring, weapons raised high. Horn met them with a bellow that shook the very air. His axe split a warrior's skull clean in half. Bone and brain matter sprang like crushed fruit. He spun, hacking through an armored chest, ribs snapping like dried twigs. A spear lunged for him. He caught it under his arm, yanked its wielder forward, and drove his axe deep into the fool's throat, nearly taking his head off. Beside him, Civ was a whirlwind of steel and fury. A sword slashed towards her. She ducked, severing the hand that held it. The man screamed, but only for a moment, before her second sword punched through his ribs. Another warrior charged, a hammer raised. She sidestepped, letting the heavy weapon crash into the ground before driving her blade through his exposed armpit. Blood sprayed across her face. She licked it from her lips and grinned, but the enemy kept coming. A brute in heavy plate swung at Horn with the greatsword. Horn barely dodged, the blade slicing across his ribs, sending a fresh wave of agony through his body. He roared in defiance, his axe finding the gap in the man's armor. Digging deep into his side, the warrior gasped, his strength leaving him, and Horn finished him with a brutal strike to the neck. His axe biting through flesh and bone until the head came free. Civ, his wife, fought like a cornered wolf. Her breath was ragged. A spear pierced her thigh. She growled in fury, grabbing the shaft and pulling her attacker forward. Slamming the pommel of her sword into his temple, he crumpled and twitched. Another came at her, a woman with twin daggers, fast as lightning. Civ barely dodged the first strike, but felt the second dagger cut deep into her shoulder. She gritted her teeth through the pain, catching the woman's wrist and twisting it until bone snapped. The woman howled, but Civ silenced her with a blade through her eye. But there was too many. Horn swung wildly now, each strike more desperate than the last. His strength was failing. A sword bit into his back, cutting deep. He stumbled forward, coughing blood. Siv turned, her eyes wide. Horn, she screamed. An enemy drove a spear into Horn's gut. He grunted, looking down at the blade now lodged deep into his stomach. Blood poured freely, soaking his fur. The warrior grinned in triumph. Horn snarled and grabbed the shaft with both hands, yanking the spear deeper into himself, pulling the fool closer. Before the man could react, Horn's axe was in his skull, cleaving through flesh and bone, splitting his face in half. But Horn swayed. His knees buckled. He caught himself, but his breath came in a ragged gasp. Siv knew. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fought her way to him, hacking through the enemy like a rabid beast. A blade slashed across her ribs. A spear scraped against her arm. She did not care. She only saw Horn, her love, her warrior, struggling to stand. She reached him, pressing her back against his. "Are you still with me?" she asked. His breath was wet with blood. He grinned. Though his teeth were red, he responded, "Always." The enemy now hesitated, even wounded, even dying. The two stood still. But they could not stand for much longer. Another wave came. Horn howled, lifting his axe one last time. He swung with reckless fury, severing limbs, cleaving skulls, and knowing the pain, ignoring the darkness creeping into his vision. Siv fought just as fiercely, but her arms grew heavy. A sword sliced across her stomach. She gasped, but drove her blade into the attacker's chest. A hammer struck her shoulder, shattering bone. She screamed, staggering. Another blade found Horn's side. He choked on his own blood. Still they fought. Still they stood. Until at last, Horn fell to one knee, his strength finally leaving him. Siv dropped beside him. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling. She reached for him. His bloody hand found hers, their fingers interlocked. The enemy surrounded them now, watching in silence, as if unwilling to finish what had already been done. Horn grinned. His vision was fading. His grip tightened on Siv's hand. "Together," he said. Siv, with her eyes full of fury and love, whispered back, "Always." The final blow fell, and with it, the blood-bound warriors passed into legend. Even in death, they had won, for the names will live forever. The battlefield was silent. The once roaring clash of steel had died. The cries of the wounded had faded into whispers, carried away by the cold wind. Only the crows remained, their black wings cutting through the gray sky, their sharp beaks pecking at the feast laid before them. At the heart of the slaughter, two warriors lay, entwined in death. Horn the Red, the mountain of a man who had felled kings and warlords alike, knelt in the blood-soaked mud. His back was slumped against the torn banners of his fallen kin. His once vibrant blue eyes were open, staring into the heavens, unseeing. His axe lay in the dirt, their edges dulled by the sheer numbers of lives they have taken. His beard was matted with gore, still framed the last defiant grin, frozen on his lips. Siv Wolfborn, his wife, his equal, rested against his chest, her lifeless fingers still entwined with his. Her swords lay at her sides, the blades broken but never surrendered. Her golden, tangled, and stained hair, stained with crimson, flooded in the wind. The deep wound in her stomach still wept blood, pouring beneath her as if the earth itself mourned her passing. The soldiers who slain them stood motionless. They had won, and yet none of them cheered. None of them celebrated because the cost had been too high. Hundreds of bodies surrounded the two fallen berserkers, a testament to their fury. Some men still clutched their throats, even in death, as if trying to hold in the lifeblood that had long since spilled. Others laid in pieces, the bodies carved apart by axes and swords that should have dulled long ago. The earth itself was soaked in so much blood that it had turned black beneath their feet. A warrior, one of the few survivors, swallowed hard as he looked upon the couple. They fought like demons, he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. No, another man muttered, gripping the wound at his side. They fought like gods. A captain, his armor dented and his face pale, stepped forward. He had seen great warriors before. He has seen men carve through enemies, but never has he seen anything like this. He stared at the bodies of Horn and Siv, intertwined in both love and death. He would have expected them to die snarling, their faces frozen in rage. But no, they had died smiling, as if they had won. The captain clenched his fist, an uneasy feeling curling in his gut. Burn the bodies, he ordered. Scatter the ashes. Let no man speak their names again. But he knew, even as the words left his lips, that it was a fool's command, because names like theirs could never be forgotten. Years later, the tale of Horn the Red and Siv Wolfborn spread like wildfire. In the north, mothers whispered their names to their children, warning them to never raise a blade against warriors of their blood. In the south, minstrels sang of the berserkers' lovers who fought beyond death itself. Their legends grew, twisted into something larger than life itself. Some claimed they had made a bargain with the gods, that Horn and Siv had been given the strength of the old spirits in exchange for their souls. Others swore that on stormy nights their laughter could be heard across the mountain, carried by the wind like a battle cry from beyond the grave. But then there were warriors, young and bold, who carved their own faces with scars to honor Siv, who braided their beards in the style of Horn, who painted their bodies in crimson before battle, believing that by invoking the blood-bound warriors, they too could fight without fear of death. But the most fearful tale came from the battlefield where they had fallen. No more grass grew there. No birds sang. The land itself had turned black, as if the blood they had spilled had forever stained the soil. And travelers spoke in hushed voices of the night, when the wind howled through the trees, of shadows that moved when none should be there, of the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. The battlefield had become cursed, and some whispered that one day, when war again called, Horn and Siv would rise again, once more, bound by not flesh, but by blood, by love, by vengeance. And so, the blood-bound warriors became more than just men and women. They became immortal. Their names would never die. For as long as battle raged, as long as blades met bone, As long as warriors cried out in defiance of death, Horn and Civ would live on forever.